Red Balloon Rock Talk.
All right, hey everybody, welcome back. It's another episode of Rock Talk, and it's Lead Balloon right here. This is Mark and my brother Jim over here. For those of you just tuning in for the first time, we're two brothers that love rock and roll music, and we come up with some crazy new episode related to rock and roll in some way. It could be anything really. We also have a new feature that we've been doing the last few weeks, which is called our Pick of the Week, and you can check that out as well. It's just our recommendations on some bands you may have heard of before, may
May
just
not
need to
have.
be re-invited to it, just to reacquaint yourself. But that's the whole idea. So we're gonna get going on this episode for you today, and it's a really hard one to kind of like narrow down into topic. So I'm gonna do the best I can
Yeah.
to tell you what we had up our sleeves when we came up with this idea. So let me give it a try. So we decided to pick some bands that, for whatever reason, has either lost their lead singer or they replaced their lead singer, and how that affected the band, whether it was through record sales or whatever. And the two bands that we focused on today were Van Halen. We all know the
Which
old
seems
Van,
like a pretty obvious choice.
yeah, right. The Van Hagar years we'll discuss a little bit, and obviously we're going to give you some background because I think as I was researching for the show today that I forgot a lot of stuff, and even though growing up around it, yeah, your brain gets a little fuzzy. So I think that's what happened here. I got a little lint in the brain here. The second group we're going to look at today and discuss a little bit about is one of my favorite bands, really. And we've talked about them before, is Allison Chains, and how the frontman change there has altered kind of the sound and maybe the originality of the band. I don't know. We'll go with that. And then we have a little surprise ending here for you.
Yeah.
So,
And I think what came out of this topic was, like Mark said, was that bands do go through changes, and they may replace an instrumentalist, they may replace a drummer or a guitarist or whatever. But does the band fundamentally change when they change the singer? Does it change the the nature of the band? Does should and maybe the bigger question is, should a band continue on with that name, or
yeah.
do they change their personality enough that maybe they go under a different name? I mean, and I think it's interesting that with Van Halen and Alice in Chains, there were two very different approaches to changing the lead singer, and um, and we'll get into all that. But I think that that created a lot of issues with fans, and why Van Halen fans um, were so polarized, and why maybe Alice in Chains fans were so supportive. So let's get into it.
Yeah, they're both unique situations as well, I think.
Yeah.
And, when thinking back to when Van Halen let go of David Lee Roth, it was kind of a miss a miss on Van Halen's behalf. Every band has that inner turmoil and issues, but they tend to work these things out. But it seems like there was a push in the band behind the scenes with Eddie and David Lee, and they kind of just ultimately went their own separate ways, as you know. And I'm going to get into that in just a moment here. But I'm going to be of the camp and just let it out there for everyone listening, whoever tunes in, even if it's 10 years from now, that my stance is and always has been that Van Halen is Van Halen with the original lineup with David Lee Roth and with Michael Anthony. I'm going to touch on a lot of the different elements as we get into this discussion here. So,
Yeah, and I'm gonna state I am of the original camp as well. So we're not gonna have back and forth.
There won't be a
But,
clash of the Titans.
it's
If you
not going to be
will.
Hagar. Like, I'm a Hagar fan. I think Sammy Hagar is extremely talented, and I really like
Right, right.
stuff that he has done on his own. But I am of the opinion as well that um, Van Halen really was Van Halen with David Lee Roth. So,
Right.
but it'll be interesting to talk through the, you know.
And I'm going to give some very simple examples as to what I think, and maybe some people relate to it. Whatever. All right, so let's get going here. Most people probably don't realize how old Van Halen is and when they kind of originated, and that started in 1974, believe it or not. And we had members at the time were Eddie, Alex, and a person by the name of Mark Stone who played bass. And eventually David Lee Roth came into the band. Um,
Do you
as
realize? Did you find in your research that that original bass player just passed away?
I did not pick that up. No.
Yeah, he just passed away. Like, I think in the last week or so. We're filming this early October in 2020, so
Right.
I think he passed away right at the end of September.
Yeah, I
And
didn't catch that. I think
yeah,
maybe I did, and I just kind of glossed over that. It was just me. But as we're talking about Mark Stone for a moment here, Mark Stone, as you know, was playing bass, but also a little bit of the singing aspect. And David Lee Roth came into the band, and really shortly thereafter, Mark left the band, and he kind of stayed really quiet. What I did hear was that he had a bass up for sale like 2013 on eBay or something like that,
yeah,
custom bass, and that was the last anyone really heard of him. But he didn't really go into playing with any other band. But David Lee Roth in 1974 came into fruition, and shortly after David Lee Roth came in, Michael Anthony joined the band as well. And so you see in 1974, there's a couple months in there where they were messing around with the lineup. But you had the original lineup there. You had Eddie, you had Alex, you had Michael Anthony, and of course David Lee Roth.
did you
Um,
find in your do they know why Mark left, or was it an internal conflict, or did
I
he
think
leave
it
on
was
his own?
just not a good fit.
Okay,
I didn't really get into the whole meat of it, and I don't think there was any animosity there.
okay,
But I think it was Mark that decided he wanted to leave, but I could be wrong. Um,
okay.
but just from what I could read and ascertain from all that, that's kind of where I was leaning towards, that he kind of just left on his own. I think David Lee Roth, with his personality, may have just kind of pushed him off to the side a little bit, and for whatever reason.
Interesting.
Anyway, Van Halen also was not Van Halen, and for the life of me, I can't. I want to say it's Mammoth. I think it was Mammoth. They called themselves before David Lee joined.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. The timeline goes 74 to 85 with the original band members. And in 85, David Lee Roth left. Now, here's the thing. David Lee Roth really wanted to go solo. And I think, maybe his britches were a little too big. His head was a little big, and his ego got in the way of things. And Eddie's ego was there. And you got to remember, in 85, 1984, 1985, they were at the pinnacle, the height of their career. There wasn't a person, I don't think, on the planet who didn't know who Van Halen was. You had one release after another that was just amazing album for whatever reason. They had 13 number one hits over their career, and they were certainly moving quite readily into that at this time frame. So David Lee goes off and does his thing. He goes and does his solo stuff, and I don't think it went very, very well. And I know there was some.
He had a couple hits, but
He had a couple of hits, My Ice Cream Girl, whatever.
yeah,
But I think ultimately he realized he made a mistake and approached Eddie and the band and said, "Hey, I'd like to come back in," but that ship sailed. And Van Halen, obviously in '85, invited Sammy Hagar in, and I think he did a good job coming in as a frontman, but it was a different sound. And if you're a true Van Halen fan, you were looking for that David Lee, that punch in the face kind of thing. Now, Hagar, his own style, has already been doing his own thing and really had made a mark in the music world just doing his own thing, and it sounds great. I mean, all of his solo stuff is I like
Yeah.
it. You know, I have
Yeah.
no problem with it, like you mentioned earlier.
By the way,
But
I
in
just
90,
looked up. Sorry to interrupt. I just
no,
looked
that's all
up
right.
Van Halen's original name was Mammoth.
Yeah, okay. So and yeah, so Sammy Hagar until 96. So from 85 to 96, you have a good decade long relationship there. And again, all the original members of the band are still there, except for David Lee Roth. Now, as I say this, let me backtrack for a second here. You know, one of my favorite albums of Van Halen is Fair Warning. Just the song Fair Warning is just that dark, in your face, gritty. Eddie just knows how to play guitar. That's like where you see Eddie coming out of there and just like it's
Yeah.
so raw. It's so in your face. I love it. It's just so. I'd never get to listen in a Fair Warning. It's such a great album. Um, you know, to the contrast of that, I love Diver Down too. I remember when you brought that album home and played it for the first time. I was like, "What? Oh, that's so
Yeah.
cool!"
Yeah.
You know, and I love Diver Down.
Yeah, I have to
You
say
know, but
my
everyone,
favorite album was Van Halen 1. I mean, that was I remember putting that on my stereo for the first time and just absolutely being blown away. That was when
yeah,
I first heard Eruption,
yeah. I
and
think everyone was blown away
you
when they
know, it was
heard Eruption. That
I,
was like,
I
you
remember
just
I
hear that.
still have kind of a vivid memory of that moment when I heard that for the first time. I was like,
Yeah.
it was just
It was
overwhelming.
such a different approach to a
Yeah.
guitar solo. And
Yep.
we've never heard that in rock history before. Like,
Yep.
how dare you open up with just a raw, in your
Yeah.
face guitar solo? There was no vocals, no drums, just Eddie just wailing on
Yeah.
the guitar. And it was like, holy moly, you know,
Yep.
I've heard a lot of solos before, but what was that? And you
Yeah.
had to go drop the needle again and play it again just to hear it again. And then, okay, let me go back one more time and listen to that one more time.
And I
So,
and the David Lee Roth's style of singing was there were you could tell that he was having fun with it. There were kind of almost like musical, like Broadway musical elements in his style.
mhm.
It was almost campish. Excuse me, and he had the high shriek and of course when you see him on stage he's very theatrical and very acrobatic, you know, with
His
his high
gymnastic skills are
jumps.
amazing, you
Yeah,
know,
very
doing flips and
gymnastic like,
yeah,
which brought a lot of energy and just a
right.
whole other element that contrasted really nicely with Eddie's pyrotechnics on the
Well, if
guitar.
you stop and think for a moment about some of the ginormous bands out at the time between 1976 and 1986, right? And you think about frontman, you think about Roger Daltrey
Yeah.
swinging his microphone around. That was his thing, right?
Yep.
Then you think about Robert Plant, who basically would always have his hands like this and was very
Oh yeah.
passionate about singing. And others out there too had their own style, but nothing like David Lee. Like he
Yeah.
would come out there, he's swinging the mic stand around, not the microphone, the whole mic stand is
Yep.
swinging around. He's running from one side of the stage to the next. You
Jumping
didn't
off
really see
risers,
that.
doing air
Yeah,
splits,
yeah.
and yeah. There was a definitely a theatricality to his style.
So yeah, I think that lent a lot to how not only Eddie's playing, but the front man, the power of the front man. And I think that's something we have to discuss there as well as, you know, their own theatrics or their own stylistic approach to how, you know, you get the audience involved. You know, they developed this thing where large arm movements, standing on the monitor stacks to make yourself look larger than life so that you
Yeah.
could penetrate to the guy sitting in the back row of a massive auditorium or a massive theater, or even the guy sitting in the nosebleed section at like that stadium or something like that. You know,
Yep.
they had to make themselves larger than life. They realized that people weren't satisfied where you just sang at the microphone
Yeah.
like this
Yeah.
and maybe, hey, how you doing, everybody? How's the crowd going? They realized that, you know, Iron Maiden was the same way. You had those theatrics were just like incredible, and their stage presence is the same thing, and
Yeah.
it's the running around. And I think David Lee Roth put a lot of that out there, and some people I don't think remember that.
Yeah. He was
If
one
you
of
start
the.
looking at,
Yeah. He was one of the.
he's a forerunner. He
Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
inventor of that stylistic approach that others copied and mimicked because they said, well, if he can do it, I can certainly do that. And
But we forget that before him, there really wasn't as much as what he was doing. I mean, he was definitely
right, and that's why I'm pointing that out, and
definitely.
because he set that stage for others to follow, and
Yep.
we can't let that slip, and that's why I wanted to talk about that in this program. You know, even Sammy Hagar was toned down because that's his style. He was never that front man. He has the vocal range, and that's the other part of this too. David Lee Roth, Eddie, when he wrote music, had to write it in a very specific area of range because David Lee Roth didn't have the range. Yeah, he could screech and squelch. That's very different than being able to sing.
That's the rock element. That's
the screeching. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of the whole rock rawness of it. And when Hagar came in, that was refined. I mean, I think what happened was, for me, was the songwriting I think got better in some ways, but they lost some of that rock edge that you hear in the Roth albums.
Well, you also have Eddie bringing keyboards in, and
Eddie was experimenting
very, very much a part of the Van Halen.
So they were getting more sophisticated with their songwriting and so forth. But what they lost, I think, was the rawness that they originally had, all the way up through Diver Down, or actually 1984, I think was the last album that Roth was on. But if I'm not mistaken,
I believe you're correct on that one.
But anyway, so I think there was this change in their style. There was a change in the rawness. There was a change in their just what they were putting out there, and I think that's where that created a lot of tension with their fans, I think.
Well, I remember the anticipation, I was a junior in high school when this all came down, and, the conversation, of course, in lunchtime and study halls and stuff. Hey, did you hear? I heard they're going to put a new album out and all this, and it's not going to be with David Lee Roth. I wonder how it's going to sound. They're going to suck. That was always the kind of, it can never be the same, you know what I mean? And 5150 came out in 1986. So that was the first album with Sammy Hagar. And of course, the first #1 album of Van Halen to go #1 on the billboards.
Yeah.
Guess they proved everybody wrong, huh? So the formula worked, and they took a big.
And I think it's because they kind of distilled down all these elements into a more slick package, and I think Hagar's vocals were. They appealed to a bigger audience, but was it really the fans that they were appealing to, or were they starting to appeal to the broader audience? Who
I think both. In retrospect, I think they appealed to everybody to some level. You always have your
what created this split? Why are so many people so adamant about Roth, and why are so many people adamant about Hagar? Why is there such a defined line? What changed, or what was that?
I don't think anybody who likes Sammy Hagar dismisses David Lee Roth either. I think they like David Lee Roth in the early years. They're not saying, well, Van Halen was only good during the Sammy Hagar years. I don't think anyone's saying that per se. I really think that there's that fine line where people like both. And it's not that I turn the radio station off when I hear a Van Halen song with Sammy Hagar in it. I don't. But at the same time, I'm not really engaged either.
Yeah, and I mean, I can honestly say, I have purchased many of the albums that Roth was on. I haven't purchased any of the albums that Hagar's on.
Or have I.
I just don't I'm not drawn to it strongly enough to invest the money.
Right.
And when I do listen to Van Halen, I go back to the older stuff. There's something about the older stuff. And whether it was the change in how Eddie approached and adding synthesizers and stuff, and I love synthesizers, I love electronic music, but I didn't think it fit what he was originally trying to do. Exactly. And I listened to early Van Halen because of what it presented, and I think there was just
that's that raw format that we were introduced to.
With and maybe it was a the corresponding change to more keyboards, and with Hagar's voice and the refinement of it, just didn't appeal to me. as much as the earlier stuff, and maybe that could be one of the reasons. I'd be interested for our listeners, our all three listeners, if you want to comment on the
Yeah, we're still
what
waiting for a comment.
maybe was the change for them.
Yeah. Well, in 1988, you had OU 812 come out, OU 812. And then in 1991, you had Unlawful Carnal Knowledge coming out, all with Sammy. And, those were good albums. They all have their place
Oh,
in
sure,
rock and
sure.
roll, and they all had their hits off of each album that sustained Van Halen's name. And then in 1996, we see a change in the band again. Sammy was let go after a decade, and again, there's some discrepancies here. I've heard interviews with Sammy Hagar talking about the departure, and even Sammy is a little bit. He's like, I thought we had a good thing, and I thought we had a really good rapport. Yeah, some of the albums were kind of sliding, and some of our performances weren't the greatest, but he was very happy and content being the front man for Van Halen. Didn't see a need to change, and that's just not the way it went down.
Yep.
And so they parted ways in '96. And in the turmoil of, or the transition time from Sammy into what would end up being the next lead singer, which I'll tell you in a second, you had Mitch Malloy, who came out and did some practicing with the band. Even Van Halen's manager said, "Oh, you got the job," and then for some real weird reason, just it kind of faded and never came to fruition. So Mitch Malloy was basically in the band for about a couple practice sessions. Let's put it that way. Whether they recorded any of that material while they were practicing, I have no idea. And it would be kind of interesting to hear what Mitch Malloy's voice sounded like while they played in studio sessions.
But none of that ever made it out to public.
Never made it out there. So if there is some material out, I'd love to hear it. I just don't know if it does exist. So that's kind of a weird thing. And then in 1996, after I guess the turmoil with Mitch Malloy, the band was just kind of hovering and kind of doing nothing. And I guess they were having some conversations. Eddie was having conversations with David Lee. And next thing you know, the rumor mill had started again. Hey, Eddie and David Lee were seen together. And we hear there's rumors that they might be getting back together. They're in the recording studio. Next thing you know, 2 singles come out. One, I love this song. And it's Me Wise Magic. I remember hearing that and went, "Oh, that's Van Halen. They're back." You know what I mean? I was like, "This is it. They're going to come back. They're going to have David Lee back." And I got really excited. And I think everyone else was like, "Well, they're back." And you heard this play on the radio. I was like, nice. I can still remember the DJs all over the place saying, "Yeah, here's the new single, and it's got David Lee Roth back in it." And I just remember thinking to myself, it's about time. This is when I'm going to go watch Van Halen live finally, because David Lee's back. And guess what? Didn't last.
Yep.
That was it. Never came into the studio, never recorded the album. David Lee was like, "Whatever happened, I don't know." I remember seeing an interview on that. And they're like, it just didn't work out, I guess. And David Lee was like ready to go. He was ready to be in the band again. And so that didn't come to fruition. So in 1997 through 1999, the original band members, again, were still in there without the exception of David Lee Roth. And now they bring in frontman Gary Cherone. If you remember Gary Cherone, he was in the band Extreme, and the Extreme was around for a short period of time, and his vocals were very, very different. So how they ended up with him, I really don't know, still to this day. But he put out one album with the band, and that was Van Halen 3. And sadly, if you ever listen to Van Halen 3, you'll understand why. That this is when Van Halen just basically flushed the toilet. And they had the hit song Without You, but they never really spent enough time, I think, in the studios writing and really refining the music. Because then they went out on tour really quickly, and it kind of had this is a hodgepodge of different songs that weren't really tied together, I guess. And Van Halen 3's tour, it was garbage. So hate to say that out loud like this, but it really wasn't. They'll even tell you it's kind of bombed. It bombed in the stores. It didn't sell very many albums, and the tour itself wasn't that great. And Eddie was certainly not playing very well at that point. He was hitting the bottle pretty hard, and that that became a serious problem for the band anyway. So that's as soon as the tour was over, basically they went to the studio for a brief time to do some writing, and it fizzled out, and that's when Gary left. So in 1999, that was the departure of Gary Sharon and that whole saga. And then Eddie took a hiatus for like 5 years, and his life was just sliding out of control.
Yeah.
He just went off on a bender, and he was drunk all the time. Did very few interviews. Just didn't work out very well for Eddie. That was too bad because here goes one of the best guitarists in the world, and one of the best bands in the world, and just to see it slide downhill for alcoholic reasons. I mean, everyone. I think most of the bands in the world had issues with alcohol or drugs, and to some extent, and whether they can keep it together, that's their thing. And it didn't hold very well for Eddie, unfortunately. Doesn't mean I don't like Eddie Van Halen. It just means he had a problem and he had to get over that problem. And I still love Eddie. So Eddie, if you ever listen to this, which you probably never will, love you, man. Anyway, in 2004, they kind of get back together again, and guess what? Sammy Hagar was invited to sing again. So they're bringing in the band again as Van Hagar goes, and
it was a mess. It was a mess. Eddie was at his lowest. He was drug addicted.
He was still drinking hard, and
but also drug addicted. He was not taking care of himself,
and he couldn't play a lick. He was too hammered on stage to play very effectively. Not the way we know Eddie can play.
Yeah.
And even Sammy Hagar was disappointed, and that was the end of that.
Well, he wanted to leave halfway through the tour. Hagar said it was the lowest point in his career, but they were threatening to sue him, so he stuck it out. But it was a mess of a tour.
Yeah, they just bombed that. It was a good vibes tour, and that was by halfway through, it was just getting to be a circus on stage, and I think there's some stuff out there on YouTube. I didn't even pay attention to look. I just wasn't interested in that. But if someone really wants to go and look for the Good Vibes tour from Van Halen,
I've heard some of the clips, and they're terrible.
Yeah, Eddie's just all over. He's too sloppy, and he was, for a classically trained guitarist.
Yeah.
To listen to the sloppiness that he was putting out there. I mean, obviously, when you're high as a kite, you're not going to play as well as you could. Once the Good Vibes tour fell apart and everything went on its way, Eddie just needed to clean up. And I guess 2007 now to the present, guess what? Van Halen is back, but you have a change with bass player. Michael Anthony is no longer there. Wolfgang, Eddie's son, is playing. Never understood that changeover. I know Eddie probably just wanted to hang out with his son and give him some exposure, but I don't know if that was the correct way to do it. At any rate, I was sad to see Michael's leave, but guess who's back on vocals? David Lee Roth.
Yep.
And he's there till today, too, still present. So I think that's kind of remarkable. And in 2012, as I flip my notes over here, they released their 12th album, A Different Kind of Truth, which I haven't heard, believe it or not. I thought I'd heard everything from Van Halen, but apparently I have not. Just tells you how you get out of sync with bands and music if you're not interested or something's not drawing you in, and I guess it wasn't enough to draw me in. So as of 2007, Van Halen as a whole, all the different genres of singers, sold over 75 million albums worldwide.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
As we stated in an earlier episode, it's hard finding information related to album sales, but that's a pretty good number. When I saw that, I was like, yeah, it would have to be something close to that. I'm comfortable with that number. It's probably up there.
Well, between the number of albums they've put out, the length of time they've been in existence,
it's very doable.
I think it would be interesting to see a breakdown how many albums that they put out with Roth sold versus how many they sold with Hagar. something tells me they probably sold more with Hagar, because of the.
I don't know about that.
I think it
Honestly,
was
I'll be
more.
honest.
I think that was a more popular era. I think they reached more people from that. I mean, you even said that they had gone to number one, or not number one, but they had like.
And their first
had,
number one billboard was with
yeah, okay.
Sammy
So,
Hagar.
which tells me that maybe they were reaching more people were buying. I don't know, but it would be interesting to see what the breakdown is. And because when you do talk about Van Halen, you can't not. In fact, I just wanted to, when you mentioned that Wolfgang came in as bass player, he was recently asked himself, who did he prefer, Roth or Hagar?
What did he say?
He was very diplomatic about it. He said they each brought their own personality and element to the group. So he was very diplomatic. He would not say one way or the other.
They say who's who, yeah.
But again, I mean, when you talk Van Halen, yeah, okay, getting rid of Michael Anthony and bringing in Wolfgang, okay, that was
it was a cheesy movie.
But it's really about those two singers when it comes down to it. And
but I find it really interesting that they've come full circle.
Yeah.
You had Hagar in twice, you had David Lee Roth in twice, but David Lee Roth is still currently with them.
And I will say that Roth and Hagar are friends.
Yeah, there's no animosity.
They did a tour together. Yeah, and they did a tour together. So they're friends, and they have talked on separate occasions and together about the whole experience with Van Halen, and but yeah, it's interesting. But that's really I think the defining element of Van Halen over the long term.
So let's answer the question then, from what I posed at the beginning and why we're doing the episode. Did the lead singer leaving the original change the dynamic of the band? And I'm going to go forward, and I'm going to say, yeah, I think it did.
I think it did.
Did it change in a negative way? No. But I think it definitely changed my perception as a listener, as a fan. I definitely stopped listening to the band because maybe it was just anger. Maybe it was I didn't care for Sammy very much. It was just a different sound. It wasn't what I was used to.
And I think, you didn't get into all the aspects of why they had a change in singer, but there was a lot of ego involved within the band, and
we've talked about ego with other bands, and it's going to get in the way,
And I think that's the fans were upset because there was an ego that took over and forced out their beloved singer or whatever.
Right, and I think that's what I carried. That animosity came over, and I was like, you know what, screw this. If they're going to get rid of David Lee for no real reason, then I don't have any real interest in.
So the opposite of that, in many, many ways, was the whole Allison Chains experience.
Nice segue.
Yes. So Allison Chains they were considered a grunge band, although they themselves consider themselves a heavy metal band. And but they were from the Seattle area. They were they came into existence around 1987, and 87. And
do you think that they got their grunge title only because they were from the Seattle area, and of course Nirvana?
I think that was a lot of it.
They got hit with that label because it was all that kind of sound at the time.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because when you look at Lane Staley, who was the lead singer, and Jerry Cantrell, who was the guitarist, they both were in like glam rock bands before they came together to form Allison Chains. And in fact, Lane Staley was the one that came up with the name Allison Chains. He was in a band prior to what we know as Allison Chains, and they were called Alice N apostrophe Chains. And he got the blessing of the former band to use that name in the incarnation that we're talking about. But so here's a band who may not have been as successful as Van Halen in terms of record sales and things like that, but they were one of the top 4 bands of that time, what we call the grunge bands that of that time, along with Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, but and Nirvana. But Allison Chains had a really unique sound, and
well, that sound was his voice.
yeah, well, and it was not only just his voice. He and Cantrell were the two vocalists. They shared vocal duties, but their harmonies. They did a lot of the melodic aspects of their songs as a two-part harmony that that went along with the dark nature of the lyrics and all that. So Lane Staley really was a central part of Alice in Chains, not just as the vocalist, but he was an integral part of the writing of the songs and all that. Unfortunately, drugs just did him in, and in a bad way. And in 2002, he ended up passing away from his drug addiction. And
but there's a whole backstory as well. I mean, you got to remember,
is.
he lost his sister and his mother within a span of a 6-month period, and it just devastated him. He was basically, in his own words, where I was left alone. I had no one else. I had no other family around me, and he was dealing with
a lot of demons,
a whole lot of stuff, and that's heavy. That's very heavy.
Yeah, and so I mean, so you have this, and by the way, so Alice in Chains ended up putting out 3 albums with Lane Staley, plus a couple of EPs, which gets into what is the difference between an album and an EP, and I won't get into that right now, but they put out 3 albums that did quite well, particularly Dirt, which was their second album. That was a huge success. So anyway, Lane Staley passed away in 2002, and Jerry Cantrell and the other 2 members of the band and they had been kind of on hiatus for a while because Lane's addiction was making it impossible for them to tour or to really do anything. And when he passed away, they had to go into mourning. They didn't do anything for several years. And in 2004, they were actually 2006. They were invited to participate in a VH1 special with the band Heart, and they brought in a singer by the name of William Duvall, who was in other heavy rock bands around the area, and they brought him in as a one-time kind of thing to they performed Rooster on this special, and Ann Wilson was so blown away by his vocal stylings that she said, "You need to sing the lyrics to this and not me," because Ann was originally going to sing the lyrics to Rooster. And
it's interesting you bring in Heart, because Heart, those ladies, man.
Yeah, and they're also from Seattle.
But the funny part is they somehow were able to work their way into other bands, namely Led Zeppelin, I'm going to talk about. But they were so good. They were friends with so many different bands that you wouldn't even think about, and they would just jam together constantly. And you don't know this behind the scenes, but they did a lot of that, and there's a lot of respect on a lot of people's behalf. Heart does not get enough recognition.
No, they don't.
Those girls can rock, and I love listening to Heart. I mean, how many people don't know Barracuda? I mean, seriously. I mean, just so many single hits that are out there, just one after another, and just such prolific songwriters. But that's for another time.
But I did listen to and watch the clip of that performance, and William Duvall was just incredible. And so Jerry Cantrell and the other band members really started this idea. They wanted to celebrate Lane's life. They wanted to do one last tour as a celebration around the world, so that people could celebrate in the music. And so they brought in William Duvall. And I will say, as a side note, although this is, it's interesting that he is a black artist. Yeah. And I think it's wonderful that here's a black artist whose world is heavy metal, and a band like Alice in Chains brings him on board. And so they did this tour, this world tour of their music, and it was a huge success, and there was no pretension in it. They really just wanted to celebrate. There was no idea that, oh, we're now reformed and we're going to push ahead. But out
Kinda
of
like
that tour, they were writing music, and they had a real heart to heart kind of um, discussion and discussions and other just kind of talks with various people about, do we carry on as Allison Chains? We've got this new material. Could it work? And they finally decided in the end that they would move ahead as Allison Chains, with William Duvall as the new vocalist. And they ended up putting out an album late, I think it was like 2008, 2009, and Black Gives Way to Blue, 2009. And it was actually a huge success, and their fans really loved it. So they had not created this animosity, but they created this sense of community because they did it in a goodwill fashion. We want to celebrate the music
originally, as you stated,
and out of that, it organically grew, and people accepted William Duvall as the singer.
But that's because they didn't want to. They weren't saying they were replacing. They're going to carry on. They're going to replace
right
with him. It was, we're going to do this out of love and respect for Lane. And I think fans have a better time adapting to that because there's an emotional response. There's that empathy feeling that goes with it. It's like, hey, they're acknowledging Lane's death in a positive way.
Yeah,
and they just want to do it right. They want to give him justice.
They definitely wanted to do it right, and I have a lot of respect for that. And I like some of their new music that came out. You know, William Duvall does not sound like Lane Staley, nor is he trying to, and they don't want him to. And the fans are embracing what he brings to it. I mean,
now it's funny you say that, because if you think about Journey for just a second, we could have brought Journey into this. Yeah. You know, you have Steve Perry's vocals, which are very, know, Steve Perry's voice, and they found a replacement that sounded just like him.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was a freak of nature in itself. That whole story is pretty cool too. But in that case, that's a whole unusual, you know, they literally were trying to replace the same guy's vocals.
Yeah.
And they almost did. And that machine.
But they haven't really put out any new material. So they're kind of more of a nostalgic act with a similar sounding voice. In fact, I happen to see something, who knows if it's real news or not, but apparently it's been said that they're paying Steve Perry not to sing so that it won't interfere with the nostalgia of what they're doing. But anyway, that's a whole other thing.
He's recluse himself. He's a family man now. He doesn't really have. He's got all the money in the world that he needs, and he's fine. He's happy. Yep.
So I think it's you know, here's a case where a band changed their vocalist in an organic way, and it succeeded, and it did not divide the fan base. Whereas Van Halen, the way they went about their changes, it ended up dividing of the fan base. Did it hurt them ultimately? Probably not in terms of album sales.
Apparently not. 75 million albums as of 2007.
Yeah.
You know.
But so Allison Chains with William Duvall has already put out 3 albums. So they've, you know, with Lane Staley they put out 3, and with William they've put out 3. So they're doing some nice things out there. And I think this leads finally to the last question. Yeah. So, you know, we're talking about this. Does a band really change? So Allison Chains, part of their discussion was, if they continued on with William Duvall, do they stay under the moniker of Allison Chains, or do they change their name and create
obviously they have, because
a different identity?
They kept the name.
And they got a lot of feedback from a lot of people, including Lane Staley's family, his father, and so forth, saying, you know, it's okay to stay with the Allison Chains name. And so they did, but they didn't take it lightly. They weren't just assuming that
they did it the right way. They really were a class act. I mean, those guys are just phenomenal.
Yeah. So here's the question. Just in the past week, again, we're filming this early October of 2020. just in the last week or so, Soundgarden, another huge powerhouse grunge band,
Yeah.
who Chris Cornell was their lead singer, and ended up passing away a few years ago, unfortunately. But they have talked about wanting to get back together. And so obviously for them to do that, they have to replace their singer. Yeah. So will that change because Chris Cornell had such a unique sound?
What an impact as a
and his sonic input.
I'm going to find a thesaurus. I swear to God. I'm going to do a new word to play with.
But his contribution obviously was a huge part of the sound of that band. And if they want to get back together, how do they get back together? Do they do something along the lines of what Allison Chains did, where they organically grow out of inviting different people in and finding somebody and then working through that? Do they change their name and play together but under a different name?
Well, I think Velvet Revolver. There's a good case right there. You have Velvet Revolver, and you have two super groups that kind of broke apart and reformed into Revolver.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. Porno for Pyros, Jane's Addiction members. You know, you have cases of these super groups coming together because of other groups, but it's not unprecedented either. You know, when Cream broke up, you had that whole. You know, there's super groups that are constantly forming from other bands. It's just a unique thing that does occur within the music industry, but does it last the test of time?
Yeah.
That is the question.
But here's a case where Soundgarden would love to, whether hopefully it's a celebration. I think it wants to be a celebration of what Soundgarden was with Chris Cornell. Does it grow organically like Allison Chains? And I hope they do. I know they want to play together. This is a way to. It's also a cathartic moment for them, just like it was for Allison Chains. By celebrating the music, it allows them to go through their own grief and in different ways. So it'll be interesting to see. And
it's a renaissance movement for both bands. It's that regeneration and then creativity. Creative wise, I think they will not just move forward. They're going to go leaps and bounds because I think they're ready for it. Their sound will definitely change. They're definitely not going to be of that grunge nature anymore because that's, let's put it out there. It's gone. It's not there anymore. It had its time and its place, but a band's evolution is just perfect example is the Rolling Stones. Look at all the different genres of the Rolling Stones start to finish. I mean, they're just it's incredible the amount of music that they have put out over the decades and decades, and they're still playing. And it's phenomenal that they can still write music and still put out really high.
You look at a band like The Who, they're down to half to what they were, and they're still trying to do some things. But then you look at Led Zeppelin, who, when John Bonham passed away, they said, no, we're not going to continue on. We're done. Without the original
the band
four members.
Was Led Zeppelin's name, but as artists go, and we mentioned this before, I even talked about it.
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin was Robert Plant, Led Zeppelin. It was Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin. It was John Paul Jones, Led Zeppelin. Each artist.
And it was John Bonham.
And there's John Bonham, and it was no question. There's no way to replace. Even when Jason Bonham sat in, it wasn't the same.
Yeah.
It was kind of the same, but it wasn't the same.
And it worked as a one-off. But it worked as a one-off or whatever. But it was
for Zeppelin to do that, I think that was a class way to go out, class act, and I've always respected that about them. I think, being a diehard Zeppelin fan, you always in the back of your mind, you always wanted to have the reunions. You always wanted them to come and play again.
Yep.
I was just at the age where I couldn't see them live, and Bonham. I was just getting into them. I was too young.
Yep.
And sadly, you get into them, any band for that matter. I think of like young Deadheads today who listen to Further and Dead and Company, and it's not the same incarnation as being able to see the Grateful Dead live in person when you see that. And then, all these other spinoffs are great. They all have the members.
However, even within the Grateful Dead, they went through several keyboardists.
So, actually, more.
Did that change the essence of the band? Not the same as changing a lead vocalist. Obviously,
in one respect,
when Jerry,
because Pigpen was a huge part of the early sound of the Grateful Dead because he did a great deal of the singing in the early years, and people don't realize that. Bobby certainly had his thing, and
Right.
Jerry too, but Pigpen had a lot of music that he did a lot of singing on. Turn on Your Love Light was like his classic. I mean, he would go on and on and on storytelling with
But
that
when
song.
he passed away, they could fill those shoes a little more easily. But
Right.
obviously, when Jerry died, that
That
was
was
the end of the Dead because of
the Grateful Dead, not the end of the
yeah, the
Dead.
Grateful Dead. Yeah, sorry. And again, I think it's just because of what not only his guitar playing but his vocal
Right.
style. And so again, I think this is a good way to wrap it up. I mean, we've
Yeah, I
given
was just thinking the
everybody
same thing.
two,
I was like,
you
all
know,
right, well,
but there, I mean, so if you have, if you've been able to stick through this entire episode, I would love to hear comments about, does a band fundamentally change with a change in the lead singer, and should that band continue on under that name, or does that lead singer, is it interchangeable, and
so what would
how
you
much does
say?
it
What
affect?
was your? I gave my thoughts on that for Van Halen. What are your thoughts as we conclude here for
On
Allison
that
Chains?
question, I
That question.
think a band definitely changes with this with the singer. I think it definitely. I think part of it has to do with how they market it, how they present it to the audience. Because I had
I would say
I
the audience. I would say the fan
yeah,
base.
the
How they
fans.
present it. I
Yeah,
think
I'll say
Allison Chains was
fans.
able to present in such a positive manner to their
Yeah,
fans.
and not every change of singer is gonna
I mean,
resonate with me. I had issues with Van Halen partly because of the way they went about changing the singers, but I also had issues. I just didn't. I preferred the earlier style from a musical standpoint. With Allison Chains, I liked what they did because it just from from the way they marketed it, but also I thought there's that word Sonic again, but I
you
think
call yourself.
sonically it to me it resonates, and I like their new stuff, and I think it worked, and so I think it definitely changes things, but I think there are so many other underlying issues too that come into play. So on that,
With that, yes, this is the conclusion of this long episode of Rock Talk. And I hope you enjoyed this one. I knew this was going to be a long one coming into this, but if you're a Van Halen fan out there and you heard any of this, you'll probably sit there and resonate with all of what we were talking about. But at the end of the day, this is Mark and Jim for Lead Balloon Rock Talk. We'll see you on our next episode. Hopefully, you'll catch that and look for our next pick of the week. And that's coming up shortly. So we'll see you soon. Hit the like button if you like this and subscribe if you haven't. All right. Be good,
bye.
everyone. See you.